Professor David Dandel, we do welcome you. Thank you so much, and we look forward to your lecture on William Tyndale, the man. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. First of all, can you hear me? Yes. Good. It is a tremendous privilege to be here. I can't tell you. I've known of and admired Tyndale House for a very long time and never actually have been here before. And thank you so much for asking me on this special occasion. I hope I don't annoy too many people by referring to Tyndale. I'm a North Country man myself, and he's known as Tyndale up there, but I notice quite a lot of you are calling him Tyndall, which I fear I can't do. So please excuse a certain northern barbarity there. In this gathering, above all, there is no need for reminders that William Tyndale gave us our English Bible. I shall, however, run through the details of his life, details which may just have slipped the memories of some who are here, before settling down to analyze briefly from his texts just why he was so important. And I shall speak for exactly an hour. So if you're standing, you may want to do the American thing and sit on the floor. In the wider world, Tyndale has only just begun to come back into view. This is partly, we like to believe, thanks to the work of the Tyndale Society. There are leaflets here on the front. Please take one and join. Which was founded 10 years ago in 1994 on the quincentenary of his birth. The society, entirely run on a shoestring by volunteers, now has 450 members across the world. The numbers are rising very rapidly. And organizes lectures. For example, on Monday week, there is our 10th annual Lambeth Palace Tyndale lecture. And then the following, early in November, the 10th annual Oxford Tyndale lecture, and so on. And conferences, our 5th big one in Oxford comes up in September next year, when the two key speakers will be, we are promised, the Archbishop of Canterbury himself and Professor Yaroslav Pelikan from Yale. And in London, Bath, Geneva, San Diego, Toronto, Washington, D.C., and just 2 weeks ago, we had a conference in Virginia. We publish a twice-yearly journal. This, I'm delighted to see that it's number 27. So many societies finish at number 3. And we've now got up to 27. And an annual scholarly journal, Reformation, which is very highly regarded and is absolutely no threat to your wonderful bulletin. No less a figure than the United States of America on his visit a year ago, in his first speech in London, referred as he began to the English Bible being given to his country by William Tyndale. The Tyndale Society was very pleased to have evidence that we have all unknowingly reached one of the White House speechwriters. In the Europe of the 1920s and 1930s, Tyndale was a towering theologian and biblical scholar. As the Reformation gathered momentum, that his knowledge of Greek and Hebrew was better than Luther's and those around him, even German scholars admit, and that is something. Tyndale gave us a wonderful Bible, a language in daily use still. The famous 1611, the authorized version as it's known, though it was never authorized, or in America, the King James Version, or, and believe me, I've heard this seriously, the St. James Version. It's no joke in America, they tell you. And people repeat the phrase, if it was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me. The St. James Version. The New Testament of the King James Version, the authorized version, is 83% Tyndale unchanged. Now, quickly through his life. Tyndale was a Gloucestershire man, born in 1494. He came of a good, quite high-ranking family. Gloucestershire was a very wealthy county through sheep. Because of the wool trade, merchants came from all over Europe, and Tyndale would grow up as a boy knowing about languages. Gloucestershire, the Cotswolds, welcomed foreign merchants. And also, Wales is only a couple of miles away, and I'm convinced that he spoke Welsh. Communications in Gloucestershire were extremely good. Oxford, not a day's walk away by road. The River Severn leading easily down to Bristol and the world. Gloucestershire was also famous. It was called God's County for several reasons, and one of them, I think, was the later reason that the Lollards were particularly strong in Gloucestershire. Langland's wonderful poem Piers Plowman was written near where Tyndale was born, and there was a great deal of preaching by Lollards in the county, preaching Paul in Romans rather than the Pope in Rome. Tyndale went to Oxford for 10 years, was at Magdalen Hall, which was then inside Magdalen College, and Magdalen Hall developed into Hertford College. In the course of his 10 years, he learned good new humanist Latin and Greek, which was then newly being taught in Oxford and taught very well. The key event in his Oxford experience, apart from his disillusion that theology in Oxford then had nothing to do with the scriptures, but was entirely Aristotle, apart from his horror at that which he expresses in some of his writing, the great event was in 1516 when Erasmus's Novum Instrumentum was printed in Basel and circulated through Europe very quickly. This was Erasmus's attempt to challenge the Latin translation which became known as the Vulgate, which had been the church's solid rock for 1200 years, by making his own translation. Only Erasmus could have achieved that and got away with it without burning. But to show everybody how good he was, and how original he was, and sometimes how naughty he was, he printed the Greek alongside, without any comment on the Greek in the title page. And this fact that the Greek New Testament had been printed in 1516 for the first time ever, raced through Europe, and became eventually the slightly problematic Textus Receptus. Tyndale was probably here in Cambridge, probably. I don't think so, but Fox mentions it briefly. There is no record in Cambridge of his attendance. And the famous meetings in the White Horse Inn, where he is supposed to have attended, I'm afraid, well, I have to say I'm very careful in this gathering, but I think legend has exaggerated them. I'm very sorry. I write in my biography, you can see it for yourself if you wish, a distinguished modern historian, that's Geoffrey Dickinson, of the Reformation may here represent many who've written glowingly about these gatherings, and I'm quoting Geoffrey Dickinson. The great majority of the men who led the first generation of English Protestants were in residence in Cambridge during the years when the White Horse meetings were in progress. This is true of Tyndale, Joy, Roy, Barnes, Coverdale, Bilney, Latimer, Cranmer, Frith, Lambert, Ridley, Rowland Taylor, Thomas Arthur, Matthew Parker, and many others who preached, wrote, accepted high office, or embraced martyrdom in the cause. This is me continuing. The names peel down the centuries. Unfortunately, the hard evidence is minimal that any of them in Cambridge were ever in the same place at the same time. Never mind in the snug of a Tudor pub. Yes, Cambridge at Tyndale's time was far ahead of Oxford. I have to admit that, I'm afraid, though I'm an Oxford man, in attending to Luther and the new Reformed doctrines. And there are some very, very great Cambridge names in Geoffrey Dickinson's list, but we shouldn't include Tyndale, I think. Erasmus, however, had certainly been here as the second holder of the Lady Margaret Chair, teaching Greek. Tyndale would have known that, and how widespread and significant was his printed Greek New Testament. If Tyndale came to Cambridge, it would be in the shadow of Erasmus. What we do know for certain is that after Oxford, Tyndale went back to Gloucestershire. He was ordained priest, and he became tutor to the children of Sir John and Lady Walsh at Little Sodbury Manor, some way south in Gloucestershire of his birthplace. He sat at their table as a priest and a modern Oxford scholar of good Latin and Greek. He introduced the Walshes to Erasmus's Enchiridion. He might even have translated it for them. There is an English translation, though it was not published until after his death, and it's uncertain who did the work. I think it is Tyndale. And there Erasmus pleads for scripture in the vernacular. And Tyndale was, I believe, already aware of his calling to translate the Greek New Testament into English and print it. He was preaching in the area. He distressed the authorities. they reviled him abominably, but they didn't punish him. That, I think, is important, because they had the ability to punish severely, but there was some respect for him. A learned clergyman, that, I'm afraid, is slightly in quotes, at Walsh's table one day said, "We were better without God's law than the Pope's." To which Tyndale famously retorted, "I defy the Pope and all his laws. If God spare my life ere many years, I will cause a boy that driveth the plough shall know more of Scripture than thou dost." And of course he did just that. And we have to remember that in the 1520s, ever since 1408, never mind translating, reading any part of Scripture in English was uniquely in England, in Europe, punishable and often by a hideous death. The previous translations to Tyndale were made in the 1380s. We know them as Lollard Bibles, under the influence, but not personally made, by John Wycliffe, who was a master of Balliol College, Oxford, and a great scholar. But from 1408, there was the severest repression in our history, which lasted for 150 years, especially in university work and university thinking. I tell the otherwise largely forgotten story nowadays, though I don't know why it's been forgotten, in this big book of mine, The Bible in English, which tells the story of the English Bible from the year dot to last Tuesday. Not quite to last Tuesday, it was published a year ago. There are copies outside. But we forget that the punishment for reading Scripture in English was burning alive. And we say, oh, he was burned alive. We forget, too, that that was a death that was deliberately lingering and could last 3 days. Because the person had to be seen to be burnt and all his property burnt to rid the world of heresy. We know of a young man in Norwich, a few years later, who was burned alive for possessing a piece of paper on which was written the Lord's Prayer in English. Tyndale needed a bishop's permission to translate, and he went to Cuthbert Tunstall, Bishop of London, a very sensible choice. Tunstall was a great friend of Erasmus, and indeed had helped Erasmus find Greek manuscripts in Northern Europe for his printed edition. Tyndale took with him an oration by Isocrates, which is in very difficult Greek, just to show how good he was, but Tunstall snubbed him. Tunstall was under the influence of Wolsey, who was planning to be the next pope. Tyndale recognized, as he wrote later, there was no place in all England for such work, so he left for Germany in about 1524. And Northern Europe was a natural place to go. Luther's September Testament of 1523, translated from Erasmus's Greek New Testament into very good German. In fact, it united Germany, the language of Luther's 1523 New Testament. It was the first bestseller in the world, was setting the mark. And England, in any case, was 2 generations behind the rest of Europe in printing, not just in printing Bibles, in printing anything. In 1500, for example, we know in Europe the names of nearly 1,000 printers, most of them by name. England at that time in 1500 had 2, neither of them any good. By 1525, in Cologne, Tyndale had a complete English New Testament ready for the press, with a long prologue and marginal notes. He started printing in Cologne, but a fanatical enemy of all reform, an enemy of Luther, John Dobnek, Cochlaeus, had the print shop raided. Tyndale and his assistant William Roy escaped in time, taking their manuscript with them, and escaped up the Rhine to the safe Lutheran city of Worms. I can't say Worms. I studied in Germany. I have to say Worms. But Worms doesn't come over very well to an English audience, so let's say Worms. And there in 1526, in that little town, he printed the first New Testament in English from the original Greek. He printed 6,000 copies, and they were smuggled unbound, of course, just the leaves, in bales of cloth down the Rhine, and eagerly welcomed on the coasts of England and circulated in England. Now, enemies of Tyndale still dispute the significance, not so much the number, but the significance of that event. But printers are not fools, and no small-town printer is going to commit himself to 6,000 copies of a book unless he knows for certain there's a market. One copy survived, and it has been considered England's greatest printed treasure. The British Library in 1994, the quincentenary of Tyndale's birth, before the Tyndale Society was formed, in fact, bought it from Bristol Baptist College for £1.25 million in order to have it on permanent public display, where it still is, in the Rip Black Gallery. It was the centre of an exhibition that I curated for the British Library, which was 4 months in London at the British Library, and then later travelled to America, to the Huntington Library in California, to New York Public Library, and finally I closed it in the Library of Congress. And my closing event there was taking round His Royal Highness Prince Philip, which was an extraordinary experience, because I was told beforehand, I was taken on one side. My wife and I went to lunch at the British Embassy. It's not something we normally drop into our conversation, but it was a wonderful lunch with His Royal Highness, and he was very funny and very witty. But before we went in, the ambassador took me on one side and said, "Professor Daniel, I must tell you, the royal attention span is not very long." Don't think it's you. But in fact, he was marvellous. Either he'd done his homework or he knew it, because at every case he was asking highly intelligent questions, getting later and later, and the curious security men behind him were going, calling into their sleeves, and gallery of pressmen were there flashing away. My wife standing there in a summer frock, and they were all saying, "Who's the guy with the Duke?" And she was saying, trying not to sound like the Queen, "Actually, it's my husband." Unforgettable experience. But even more important in that experience in Washington was the fact that people came up to me in Washington and said, "We have travelled to see this exhibition in all 3 places." There is another copy in St. Paul's Cathedral Library, but it's severely damaged. It misses 72 pages, which is rather serious. And then in 1994, a friend of mine, Dr. Eberhard Zwink, in the Landesbibliothek in Stuttgart, decided in a very dramatic way that they better redo their catalogue, and they found on a shelf marked heavily bound in calf as 1556 that in fact it was an impeccable mint copy, misbound, of Tyndale's 1526 New Testament, complete with a title page. Now, the British Library copy doesn't have a title page because in the 18th century there's a great fashion for collecting title pages rather as we collect stamps. You slash the title page out and mount it in the volume because nobody can now find it. But the Landesbibliothek copy has a title page which is as follows: "The New Testament as it was written and caused to be written by them which heard it, to whom our Saviour Christ commanded that they should preach it to all creatures." Wonderful. It's a pocketbook. The British Library facsimile you'll see outside, and you can buy that. It's a pocketbook, as all Tyndale's books were, just to be slipped into the pocket. And its circulation was huge, we do know that. And it was read in churches. And it must have been astounding. We have to take this in. For congregations who were used to a priest with his back to them, standing far off at an altar, muttering, "Petite adobita vobis, quaelitis et advenitis, pulsati et aperiuta vobis," and so on. Suddenly to hear spoken to them straight out down front, "Ask and it shall be given you, seek and ye shall find, knock and it shall be opened unto you." The revelation and revolution must have been astonishing. But Cuthbert Tunstall preached in St. Paul's Cathedral, still under the thumb of Wolsey, a sermon denouncing it, saying he'd found 2,000 errors in it. Of course he had. I mean, Tyndale was translating from the Greek, not the Church's Latin, and there are very significant differences. And Tyndale later wryly wrote that if he failed to dot an I, they would accuse him of heresy. Tyndale heard of the burning of a large pile of these at St. Paul's Cross. A lesser man would have given up. Not at all. He was in Worms, where there was a strong rabbinic school, so he learned Hebrew. Hebrew was not possible to be learned in England. There were trilingual colleges beginning in Europe, teaching Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, just beginning. Cambridge, I'm happy to say, led England in Hebrew, and there were two brothers named Wakefield, both of whom were proficient in Hebrew at Tyndale's time, but neither of them was interested in translating. Their interest was rather antiquarian, as an odd language. Tyndale moved to Antwerp. Antwerp was a very sensible move. There were many printing cities in Northern Europe, but Antwerp was, I described it as the Silicon Valley of Europe of the time. It was the great center, and of course commercially it was wonderful for circulation on ships. A recent calculation, I'm told, has found in 1528 60 printers in one street alone. It was a great industry in Antwerp. He printed his first long non-biblical book, The Parable of the Wicked Mammon. We call it The Unjust Steward, where he works through the whole business of faith versus works. And then The Obedience of a Christian Man in 1528, his greatest non-biblical work, which Penguin published in Penguin Classics in 2000. I was delighted to be asked to edit it. It's very hard work editing it, but I was delighted to. Now, I tried to get Penguin Classics interested in others, in The Wicked Mammon in particular, but Pearson, the American owners of Penguin, far from being interested, tried to withdraw this. A Penguin Classic? And Pulpit, on the grounds that they're not interested in backlists. Penguin Classics? I mean, they should last for 40 years. Anyway, my beautiful editor and me, we fought very hard, and it's still in print and still about. And we're still trying to get Wicked Mammon done. From his Hebrew, he published in 1530 the 5 books of Moses. The first time Hebrew had been translated into English. These were available as little single books, the 5 Pentateuch books you could have singly or together. And they must have been amazing. They were also received very eagerly and immediately denounced as heresy. But think that in the first chapter you're finding not fiat luxet luxerat, or even Wycliffe's be made light and made is light, but Tyndale's ringing let there be light, which is where the phrase comes from, and which I see every week somewhere in a newspaper. It must have absolutely astonished readers. Here a bit of Genesis 3, the beginning of Genesis 3. But the serpent was subtler than all the beasts of the field which the Lord God had made, and said unto the woman, Ah, sir. I love that. Why is the serpent calling Eve sir? I'm more to say about that later, but I mean, at the time, late medieval times, you could call a mixed gender group by the masculine form, but it's not that. Americans tell me he's actually saying, ah, sure, but this is not true either. I think there's a very good reason, which I'll come to later, why he says, ah, sir. That God hath said, note the dismissal, that God hath said, ye shall not eat of all manner trees in the garden. Now, the Hebrew here is garrulous, and Tyndale is garrulous. This is not a sexist remark. And the woman said unto the serpent, of the fruit of the trees in the garden we may eat, but of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden said God, see that ye eat not, and see that ye touch it not, lest ye die. Then the serpent said to the woman, tush, ye shall not die. Isn't that wonderful? This great Tudor word tush for superior dismissal. Horatio uses it at the beginning of Marcellus, I think, the beginning of Hamlet. Tush, it will not appear. Tush, ye shall not die, but God doth know that whensoever ye should eat of it, your eyes should be opened, and ye should be as God, and know both good and evil. And the woman saw, and took the fruit, and ate. More of these books have survived, happily, but something else happened. Tunstall, still under the thumb of Wolsey, gave the Chancellor, Sir Thomas More, permission to read Tyndale's heretical books in English, which he needed permission, and asked him to attack Tyndale in English. More was by now a seasoned attacker of Luther in Latin, often obscenely. If you know More's attacks on Luther in Latin, they really are hard going. It is appallingly filthy, this stuff. More's Dialogue Concerning Heresies, his first major book in English, of June 1529, is a long, devious and tricky book, fiercely attacking Tyndale, and was clearly to Tyndale's surprise. And really, More's attack throughout this long book amounts to nothing more than More's horror at Tyndale mistranslating 4 words. Ecclesia as congregation instead of church, agape as love instead of charity, presbyteros not as priest, Tyndale had it first as senior, and metanoio, very significantly, Tyndale correctly translated as repent, and not, as the Vulgate has it, do penance. It's significant, that, isn't it? More does not come out well from his attacks on heretics. Tyndale replied in a short, factual, point-by-point little book called An Answer to More, his only response. But most importantly in Antwerp, never mind More, Tyndale was working on the revision of his New Testament, and in 1534 he produced his second New Testament with fine prologue and some brief marginal notes. As you will see, this is the modern spelling edition which Yale produced, which is on sale out there, and it is in fact this 1534 New Testament which went forward to all other English New Testaments. These brief marginal notes, you will see, are not, as is often said, violently anti-Catholic. Far from it. In the prologue, benefit of his Hebrew, even in the New Testament, is observable to Tyndale. He comments the fact that he has found, what readers will find, changes from the 1526 are probably attributable to his new knowledge of Hebrew. And he was the first to discover and develop some suggestion that Hebrew may be underlying some of the New Testament. Every book except Acts and Revelation has a brief explanatory prologue, and there's a very long prologue to Romans, which I print here, a revision of Luther in his 1523 New Testament with Tyndale's own moving revisions and additions. And that is the real foundation of the English New Testament. It went forward to become 83% of the authorized version. It was the English Reformers' book. Queen Anne Boleyn had a copy, which the British Library has, and I've had it in my hands, and round the 4 edges is written Anne Boleyn Queen in Latin. But, you know, she did the schoolgirl thing of writing her name around the 4 edges. Quite a number of these survived. In Antwerp he wrote other fine books, expositions of the Sermon on the Mount and the Epistles of John, but he was working solidly through the Old Testament and finished Joshua to 2 Chronicles. He had previously done Jonah. Did he get to the poetical books and the prophets? It seems not. It seems that we shall never know. It is such sadness that he didn't, because Tyndale's Job, or Tyndale's 2nd Isaiah, Tyndale's Jeremiah, never mind Tyndale's Psalms, would have been absolutely gorgeous. The Psalms embedded in the Pentateuch, or not the Pentateuch, the historical books, we can see, yes, some in the Pentateuch, we can see he would have done very well with Hebrew poetry. The historical books Joshua to 2 Chronicles were published after his death. What is astonishing is that outside the Pentateuch he moves into such a new range of Hebrew, all sorts of kinds of Hebrew, and he matches this with a new range of English. Nobody, believe me, nobody was writing with that range of English in the 1530s except Tyndale. Let me give you 2 examples. He's conscious of the different colours of Hebrew in the historical books, unlike the more restricted Hebrew of the Pentateuch. And he revels in this range. No one, absolutely no one, could achieve the epic style that Tyndale gets. For example, in this passage in 1 Kings 18, where King Ahab is challenged by the prophet Elijah, Tyndale uses the Greek form from the Septuagint instead of Elijah. And when Ahab saw Elijah, he said unto him, Art thou he that troubleth Israel? And he said, It is not I that trouble Israel, but thou and thy father's house. And just a bit later, And Elijah came unto all the people and said, Why halt ye between 2 opinions? If the Lord be very God, follow him. or if Baal be he, follow him. And the people answered him not one word. Now those three final thumps are magnificent. It's exactly what it needs. The Authorized Version revisers changed it to not a word, as do many moderns, and that lightly running anapaest is quite wrong, da-da-da, for not one word. Tyndale there is magnificent. Or another very small example, in 1 Kings 10, the chapter in which the Queen of Sheba arrives to visit King Solomon, the climax of the account is the regularity of Solomon's imports of wealth. Tyndale translates, "And as for silver, it was nothing worth in the days of Solomon. For the sea ships which the king had in the sea, with the ships of Hiram, came every 3rd year, laden with gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks." Sends shivers up my spine, that still. It's the apes and peacocks that surprise, the special exoticism, creatures of movement and colour, characterizing wealth indeed. Now, the Hebrew at this point, I'm told, in 1 Kings 10 is difficult and can best be expressed, especially as the Septuagint translator looked at it, as gold, silver, and 3 funny things. The first of the funny things is a compound beginning teeth, though what kind is not known, and the other 2 are quite unknown, though probably exotic living things, possibly simian, and all 3 words in the Hebrew are hapax legomena. The ships may yet turn out to have brought gold, silver, possibly ornaments made of some kind of teeth, and perhaps 2 kinds of furry animals, but a translator simply cannot say that. What he or she has to do is to make the best available guess and hit hard and clearly. The kingdom of God is not going to fail to come if he or she prints apes and peacocks when it should be little bears and baboons. What Tyndale wanted was the pattern of the consonants and vowels in English, where the O and E of gold and silver chime with the O and E of ivory, and the Y and the O of ivory then chime with peacocks, and the 2 P's relate to their vowels in balance, apes and peacocks. And the dactyl of ivory led to the single strokes of apes and then the falling vowels and firm K's of peacocks make a cadence, something Tyndale is uniquely good at doing, incidentally. In the summer of 1535, while he was continuing his Old Testament translation and living safely as he thought in the English house in Antwerp, he was tricked into arrest by a horrible Englishman called Henry Phillips, who was paid a lot of money for ensuring Tyndale's arrest and ultimate death. This horrible man had embezzled all his father's money. He was supposed to be taking his father's estate money to London, and he squandered it all and spent it, and he was desperately needing money. So he arranged to have Tyndale betrayed. Officially charged with being a heretic, Tyndale arrested, was cast into a cell in Vilvoorde Castle outside Brussels, and he was there for 16 months without light in the evenings, his request for his own warm clothing and books ignored. What we don't recognize until we think about it was that he wouldn't hear any English in that time. He was the great master of the English language and wouldn't hear any. Indeed, the greatest scholar in Europe, as I believe, was there in darkness for 16 months. He wouldn't even know of the success of his translations, because nobody would come to him and tell him of them. He was interrogated by senior prosecuting scholars from the New Catholic University of Leuven, established for that purpose, and not for the purpose of trying Tyndale, but to remove heresy, and condemned. Outside the castle on the morning of 6th of October 1536, having been publicly degraded from the priesthood, Tyndale was tied to a stake and garroted. His body was burned. That he was not, as heretics had to be burned alive, was in view of his stature as a scholar. His last words were said to be, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." Henry VIII was already moving towards encouraging English Bibles, but the moves were a few months too late for Tyndale. Now, my second major section, which will be shorter, is to look at how we are at the beginning of the 21st century at Tyndale's several reputations. First of all, we're delighted to know, being rediscovered as the founding father of the English Bible, the most influential book the world has ever known. The chaplain to the English house in Antwerp, where he'd been living, John Rogers, assembled all that Tyndale had translated and printed after his death, and the unpublished manuscript of his translation of the next quarter of the Old Testament, the historical books, arranged their publication in Antwerp in 1537 in a complete volume known for reasons of security as Thomas Matthew's Bible. Rogers took the second half of the Old Testament, which Tyndale hadn't reached, from the 1535 Antwerp translation made by Miles Coverdale, which is not from the Hebrew. Matthew's Bible circulated freely in England less than 12 months after Tyndale's execution. It's tragic, that. It was absorbed into new work by Coverdale, the Great Bible, issued in 1539 at the direction of the king, and to be placed in every one of the 9,000 parishes in England, alongside Erasmus's paraphrases of the New Testament. Here, more significantly, Tyndale's work was the basis of, first, a New Testament translated and printed in Geneva in 1557, made by exiles from the persecution under Queen Mary Tudor. John Rogers was himself the first of 300 martyrs under Mary. He was burned under horrible circumstances. And then the similarly made Geneva Bible of 1560. The latter was a work, I'll come back to it in a second, of great distinction in the quality of printing, in the comprehensive aids to study, in notes, essays, illustrations, and maps, but above all in the now forgotten achievement of the handful of men who made that volume, especially in translating for the first time into English, and well, the second half of the Old Testament, the difficult part, being all of it poetry. The Geneva New Testament was revised in Oxford in 1576, and new notes on Revelation were added in 1599. Before it was pushed out for political and commercial reasons in the mid-17th century by the new 1611 King James Bible, I tell an otherwise unknown story of the rivalry of printers to get hold of the King James Bible, and the fact that its success was largely a rather vicious commercial one. Geneva was the Bible of the nation, with almost 1 million copies bought between 1560 and 1640. Again, it has to be stressed that the common condemnation of Geneva Bibles, handed down by writers who've never held a copy, that they're full of Calvinism that was quite unacceptable in Elizabethan and Jacobean England, is both false to those Bibles and misunderstands the age. Similarly, a parallel observation, often repeated and again made by those who've never studied those Bibles, about the virulent anti-Catholic marginal notes in all Geneva Bibles, is another myth. It's true that occasional marginal notes added to the Book of Revelation in some Geneva Bibles from 1599 attack some older popes, pontiffs like Gregory VII and Gregory IX and Boniface VIII, who was so hated by Dante that he placed him upside down in a subterranean furnace in hell. But the wholesale hatred of Catholics in Geneva Bibles so frequently canvassed is, like total immersion in Calvinism, simply not there. And I personally wince when I hear the wonderful Geneva Bibles referred to as the Breeches Bible, which is a stupid old title. I hope you will never use it. For these poetic and prophetic books, King James's men went again without acknowledgement to the work of that handful of exiled scholars in Geneva 50 years before. Their English Geneva Bible was a very great success, went through 120 fresh editions, and immediately became simply the Bible for everyone in England. It's how Tyndale went on to reach a larger world. In 1560, it was instantly used all over the land by the highest and the lowest, and remained in place for nearly 100 years. We know this from contemporary references. It was Shakespeare's Bible. Even arch-conservative Archbishop Laud, for example, automatically preached from it. And as I said, nearly 1 million copies were sold before 1640 in a population of around 6 million. When, in the very long preface in 1611, which you may be interested to know I print entirely, it's very hard to get hold of this, so I print it entirely at the back of my book. It's very long. King James's translators in their preface, when they quote scripture, which they do frequently, they don't do it from their own work, but they do it from Geneva. Yet, these earlier workers are today quite unknown. even though they translated half the Old Testament for the first time from Hebrew. It annoys me in America when I hear that funny little man King James, his name, attached to the great translation. He had virtually nothing to do with it. Again, I tell the story here. Almost nothing to do with it. And yet those 5 or 6 brilliant scholars in Geneva who did half the Old Testament are completely forgotten. Look at, in Geneva, if you get a copy, the famous chapter 40 of Isaiah, beginning, comfort ye, my people. And you'll find that all but 1 or 2 words are identical in the authorized version. They've seemed to have been lifted out. And yet King James, funny man, has the name. The success of Geneva was in spite of there being, as well as the King James, 2 other rivals, the Bishop's Bible, 1568, in which the Hebrew work was poor, that's kind, and the Catholic Reims New Testament of 1582, followed by the whole Catholic Douay Bible in 1610. And those were both marked by prologues and notes expressing intemperate hostility to the heretics, by which words they mean Tyndale and his successors. Neither publication had any significant impact on English life. The frequent statement that King James's revisers relied heavily on the Reims New Testament is not borne out by study of the matter. That is another myth. An even partly diligent student can follow Tyndale's Bible work from his first editions between 1526 and 1534, especially 1534, and the Old Testament historical books in 1537, right through all later versions, and even silently in what may at this time correctly call the violently Catholic Reims New Testament. Interestingly, I am regularly rebuked in public for saying that Wycliffe and Tyndale especially were necessary. I'm usually attacked curiously in exactly the same words. I've never discovered why this is, and I'm now quoting a recent letter in the Daily Telegraph. This says that there had never been any need in England of anything but the Latin Vulgate, the brilliant work of St. Jerome. And the illiterate housewife in the 15th century knew her Bible well through the homilies of the parish priest and through the Bible scenes from the Golden Legend and other popular collections, as well as the paintings and stained glass in churches and the mystery plays. I sigh. How did the housewife know Latin for the Vulgate? In any case, it's anything but brilliant. You must remember that Jerome, who was brilliant with Hebrew, never got beyond the Gospels and the New Testament. A trawl through sermons of the time catches the very tiniest of biblical scraps, still in Latin. How did the housewife afford Caxton's magnificent Golden Legend, printed as a collector's item, which has anyway very little indeed of the Bible? What were those other collections? Church paintings and glass could only show a few events. And it's difficult to make a painting or a play out of the Epistle to the Romans. I sigh again. The truth is that Tyndale and the 16th century printed English Bibles, bought in millions, were a revelation to the common people and caused a complete revolution. Secondly, for lovers of the English language, Tyndale is the genius who, in those widely read English Bible translations, gave England in the middle of the 16th century its first disseminated plain style, so that anyone who had anything to say had a simple model to follow. I do go into this in this book quite in detail. Later in the century, no longer did a man or woman need to be part of a refined elite, learned in the ancient classics and the literature of France and particularly Italy, as for example Sir Philip Sidney insisted, in order to write well and be read. Decades before, at the start of that 16th century, while Tyndale was at Oxford, the English language had become a mess, quite lacking direction, muddling older Saxon and Norman French with Latinist vocabulary and rambling syntax. It was at the bottom of the pond. In about 1505, John Skelton, the poet at the court of King Henry VIII, wrote verses to say so, beginning, "Our natural tongue is rude, and I can't say anything in it." It was unthinkable that the English language would carry any freight of any weight, epic, for example, never mind the Bible. It's unthinkable now, when we have 2 billion English speakers in the world, either first, second, or third language, to think that English, when Tyndale started in 1526, was as unknown and insignificant in the continent of Europe as Scots Gaelic is today in the city of London. And Tyndale changed all this. From the mid-1520s, he wrote English in a register just above common speech, in short Saxon sentences with largely Saxon vocabulary and manner-like proverbs. And the result was easily memorized, as the New Testament Gospels, for example, were intended to be. Ask and it shall be given you, seek and ye shall find, knock and it shall be opened unto you. Or, for this my son was dead and is alive again. Or, let there be light. Or, the Spirit is willing. And from this injection of plain style into England from 1530 came that growth of language and literature which produced that nest of singing birds between 1590 and 1610, of which Shakespeare is the heart. 10 years ago at the Quincentenary, in a broadcast, I dropped the remark, without Tyndale, no Shakespeare. This now comes back to me as there's an old saying, without Tyndale, no Shakespeare. I'm proud to be the maker of an old saying. Not too old, I hope. Let me give you a quick example of Shakespeare's. I'm a Shakespearean by trade, and I'm constantly amazed at the sort of clarity, the Tyndalian clarity of his language. For example, 1 Henry IV, first part of Henry IV, just before the Battle of Shrewsbury, the big fat knight, the friend of the Prince Hal, is afraid he's going to be killed the next day. And as a Latin-educated knight, he doesn't say to Hal, the imminence of the approaching hostilities exacerbates my facilities with apprehension. Shakespeare makes him say, I would to a bedtime, Hal, and all well. That's the Tyndale of the parables. Thirdly, for conservative modern historians, Tyndale, if he's mentioned at all, this is a polite phrase for Catholic historians, is the nasty little man, he's known in some Catholic circles as Tiny Tyndale, who, a mere heretic, got up the nose of the great St. Thomas More. They refer only to Tyndale's polemic works, like his Practice of Prelates of 1530 or Answer to More of 1531. Such historians may, though not always do, add a footnote to mention that Tyndale translated the Bible, with the suggestion that it was an inconsiderable and rather odd thing to do. What matter to them are his unbridled attacks on Mother Church. He is lewd, even foul-mouthed. When on opening his text examples of these characteristics fail to appear, they are put in his enemies by his mouth. I'm not making this up. I can give illustrations of how this has been done. Patience is needed to explain that all Tyndale's non-biblical writing had a far wider canvas than the supposed scoring of nasty points, being no less than New Testament theology. More attacked Tyndale, clearly to Tyndale's surprise, forcefully over some years, sometimes obscenely, in several books, and at very great in his last book, Confutation, unfinished, 500,000 unreadable words attacking Tyndale. Sir Thomas does not come out well out of the study of the attacks on the reformers, as I said. More called Tyndale, among other things, a hellhound in the kennel of the devil, discharging a filthy foam of blasphemies out of his brutish, beastly mouth, and worse. Though Tyndale is a large part of More's story, More is a small part of Tyndale's, and his answer to More, Tyndale's answer to More is factual and brief. I've just come back from America, and I saw an American documentary, hour-long documentary about Tyndale, in which a Catholic scholar from Leuven said that Tyndale attacked More, More attacked Tyndale, Tyndale attacked More attacked Tyndale, and so on, and this is called polemic. This is completely untrue. Sitting in that public viewing of the documentary, I shouted, "That's not true!" But it's not true. More attacked Tyndale, Tyndale made one reply and finished. There is no great sort of polemic tennis match. Tyndale's large Bible work has survived beyond anything dreamed of for More's writing. Tyndale, through English Bibles, has reached more English readers than Shakespeare. And it's Thomas More, however, who remains lodged in the popular mind. And that's probably because he's Paul Scofield anyway. And a man for all seasons. A fourth reputation is just beginning. Tyndale was more than a mildly theological thinker. He's at last being understood as theologically as well as linguistically well ahead of his time. And I'm interested that the Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Rowan Williams, in his new book of this year, English Anglican Identities, says that Tyndale, he's now convinced that Tyndale was, quote, the true theological giant of the English Reformation, unquote. For Tyndale, as several decades later for Calvin and in the 20th century for Karl Barth, the overriding message of the New Testament is the sovereignty of God. Everything is contained in that. It must never, as he wrote, be lost from sight. Tyndale is far from being, as is usually been served up until now, quite derivative, with slivers of Luther and a drizzle of Zwingli. That same American documentary had that same Catholic commentator from Leuven saying, when asked what was Tyndale's theology off screen, he replies on to camera, "Oh, he's just in the shadow of Luther." Again, I shouted, "Wrong! It is wrong. He's not." The work that's been done by Dr. Ralph Werrell, and we have a lecture on November the 4th in Oxford, the 10th Oxford Tyndale lecture, being given by the chaplain to Hertford College, Dr. Simon Oliver, on Tyndale's theology, which I think is going to tell us a lot of good new stuff. Please do come to that. Tyndale were now being shown as original and new, except, of course, that he was old, demonstrating the understanding of God as revealed in the whole New Testament. For Tyndale, God is above all sovereign, acting in the individual and in history. He is the one in whom alone is found salvation and flourishing. When he wrote, this was very far from being said even by Luther. What was sovereign in the 1530s, as it had been for 1200 years, was the Church and ultimately the Pope. Tyndale showed how much that is a distortion of the New Testament. I want to finish with examples of Tyndale at work. First of all, going back to Genesis 3 and the serpent. The Hebrew for the serpent, I'm told by Hebrew experts, I had the privilege of working alongside while I did the Tyndale Old Testament and other things, Michael Weitzman at UCL, who was one of our greatest Hebrew scholars, who unfortunately died after he was one of the first victims of economy class syndrome. But he assured me that Tyndale, he would sit with me at my desk in UCL with Tyndale and his Hebrew Bible. He didn't need to look at his Hebrew Bible, he knew it by heart, and kept saying with his finger on Tyndale, "This is marvelous, this is wonderful, this is terrific." And he assured me that Tyndale's understanding of the tricky Hebrew around the serpent was clever. Hebrew makes the serpent unusually subtle. I think about the Hebrew for the serpent is unusually subtle, and Tyndale makes the serpent exploit a Hebrew ambiguity in God's words. I got this from Michael Weitzman. "For the same day thou eatest of it, thou shalt surely die." Is that a simple command, his irrecoverable law, or a conditional, or a simple future? I can't here go into the Hebrew, but the serpent, after the confusion of sir, I think that's why he says it, you see, just to confuse Eve, introduces a further confusion. What Eve understood as a command, the serpent turned into a wish, or a suggestion to be discussed or bargained over. Tyndale catches this Hebrew confusion by making the serpent use an English conditional modal auxiliary, should. "Whensoever ye should eat of it," perhaps you won't, but perhaps you will. Who knows? Your eyes should be opened, though of course they might not be. It might be a trick by God. "And ye should be as God." Being as God, says the serpent, is no big thing. It's always open to you to choose whether to be that or not. Tyndale's been alert to the Hebrew mixture of what we might call imperfects and imperatives, used for different purposes by the serpent, to make a God who merely makes predictions which are open to discussion, even to curious experiment. The serpent knows that Eve didn't hear God herself. The true subtlety of the fall in Hebrew and in Tyndale was the temptation not so much to eat the apple as to misrepresent God as being open to minor experiment. King James's men lost it with simple shalls, simple futurity. And so do all the shiny modern versions that I've seen. Tyndale was the first to put Hebrew into English, and his serpent is truly subtle. A new word in English, first used by Tyndale there. My second example tells of a death and shows of the skill of Tyndale in both characterization and storytelling. At the end of 2 Samuel 8, as you know, a long sweep of narrative over 6 chapters about David's beloved son Absalom, who was misled by a crafty counselor, Ahithophel, and led a rebellion against his father, comes to a climax in the death of Absalom and the breaking of the news to his father in these words. And the king said to Hushi, "Is the lad Absalom safe?" And Hushi answered, "The enemies of my lord the king and all that rise against thee to have thee be as thy lad is." And the king was moved and went up to a chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, thus he said, "My son Absalom, my son, my son. My son Absalom, would to God I had died for thee, Absalom, my son, my son." The force of the double repetition of Absalom and my son twice is painful enough for a father in sudden and desperately pointed grief. But between the pairs, Tyndale puts that anguish cry of David and makes it entirely in monosyllables, in two triplets and a doublet, so that it runs, "Would to God I had died for thee." It's the end, they're the last words of the long story. Something surely Shakespearean in its linguistic power. I want to read 3 passages from the New Testament and make a brief comment. First, from the famous Christmas stories of Luke 2, which, as we read them, are still very much Tyndale. You remember the shepherds revealed by the angel. Tyndale goes on, "And it fortuned, as soon as the angels were gone away from them into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, Let us go even now unto Bethlehem, and see this thing that has happened, which the Lord hath showed unto us." Now, I want you to hear the A sounds here. The way that the New Testament is memorable, is made to be memorable. Tyndale locks the next sentence with A sounds, with Mary at the center. I'm going to exaggerate it. "And they came with haste, and found Mary and Joseph and the babe laid in a manger. And when they'd seen it, they published abroad the saying which was told them of that child. And all that heard it wondered," hold on to that word, wondered, "at those things which were told them of the shepherds. But Mary kept all those sayings and pondered them in her heart." The chime between wondered and pondered is so beautiful. And also, Tyndale, as Luke, knows what it is for a young woman to ponder something in her heart. And then from Luke 16, just a few words from the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Lazarus is the only man, as you know, I don't need to tell you this, he's the only man in the parables who is named. And his name means God helps. It's nothing to do with leprosy, that's a later addition. And it's interesting that his name means God helps, whereas the rich man is beyond help. Being in hell in torments, the rich man lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham afar off and Lazarus in his bosom, and cried and said, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus, that he may dip the tip of his finger in water." Those little I sounds, dip the tip of his finger. That's so characteristic of Tyndale. Such a tiny touch, but so important. Nobody else has got it since him. "Dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue." And then the dark vows of "cool my tongue, for I am tormented in this flame." And finally, to read from Matthew 26, part of the Gethsemane story, part of the Passion story, the Gethsemane. I'm going to read 120 words, as it amounts to, of which only 4 are not Saxon, apart from proper names. "Then went Jesus with them unto a place which is called Gethsemane, and said unto the disciples, Sit ye here, while I go and pray yonder. And he took with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, and began to wax sorrowful and to be in an agony. Then said Jesus unto them, My soul is heavy, even unto the death. Tarry ye here and watch with me. And he went a little apart, and fell flat on his face, and prayed, saying, O my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt. And he came unto the disciples and found them asleep, and said unto Peter, What? Could ye not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray, that ye fall not into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. These qualities of great clarity and accuracy, and always speaking directly to the heart, that Tyndale has given us, matter a great deal, and we have to work hard to hold on to them. Tyndale, in the Passion story, when Peter has just realized that he's betrayed his master, Tyndale has, and Peter went out and wept bitterly. You can't put it better. Rhythmically it's perfect, for the Greek it's perfect. A modern American translation has, Peter left and cried hard. Now that is appalling. Forgive me saying so, but it is. As my wife said, that's what a baby does when it's hungry. But imagine St. Matthew Passion, for example. Think of the melisma on, as the evangelist sings, and Peter wept bitterly. Pure Tyndale. Tyndale is translated into German, of course, there. Or even worse, Tyndale at 1 Corinthians 13, talking about love, as you all know, finishes with, then shall I know, even as I am known, which is almost infinite in its understanding of the importance of love. Then shall I know God and a loved one, even as I am known by God and a loved one. A modern American translation, which is extremely popular, has at that point, it won't be long before the weather clears and the sun shines bright. This is a translation called The Message. And I saw in a religious bookshop a panel against it saying, over 10 million so. What can one do? Even beyond those solid everlasting gifts to Bible in English, accuracy and clarity, and the register above common speech, Tyndale's craftsmanship in making English sentences out of Greek and Hebrew and writing on his own can amount in his vocabulary, in his sense of rhythm and cadence, to a work of genius. I use the word with care. I'll finish with this. Writing to readers at the beginning of his Obedience of a Christian Man, here, the very beginning, about the hatred of Jesus by the officially religious in the Gospels, he concludes the passage with what amounts to the Gospel story in a nutshell, which applies also to giving the English Bible against the fierce opposition of the church. Tyndale writes, finally, when they had done all they could, and that they thought sufficient, and when Christ was in the heart of the earth, and so many bills and poleaxes about him to keep him down, and when it was past man's help, then holp God. When man could not bring him again, God's truth fetched him again. Thank you.
The words expert and expertise, I think you'll agree, are used very lightly and loosely these days. But what we've benefited from this morning has been a display of expertise in the true sense, and for that we are very grateful. Professor Daniels, we have enjoyed a very informative lecture which has been delivered with a great deal of enthusiasm, as is the mark of a great teacher, with a great deal of humour and historical insight, as one would expect of someone who has laboured so long over the subject matter. You mentioned earlier on in your lecture the royal attention span. These days we're told that the average student's attention span is no more than 20 minutes. And at that point in a talk, well, we should stop and do something else, or get everyone to stand up and move around and that kind of thing. Well, for me anyway, and I'm sure for most of us here, all of us I'm sure, you have held our attention and held our interest for the whole hour. And again, we thank you for that. Again, they say that a mark of a good lecture, and one which has made its point and made its impact, is that there is often a change in attitude takes place in the hearer. And I think for myself, I will come away with this with a greater sense and a greater appreciation for the contribution of Tyndale both to the development of the English language and of course to the spread of the gospel and the expansion of the kingdom here in the UK and worldwide. So thank you for giving us such a memorable start to what we anticipate to be a memorable day. Thank you again.
Thank you.